A racist cop angrily arrests a homeless man who stopped him from assaulting a black teen, but soon discovered his connection with the captain. It was late afternoon in the city park, a place where the golden hour painted everything in soft, glowing hues. Families strolled lazily, children played, and the cool breeze rustled the trees. Among the scattered park benches and meandering pathways, Jasmine, a teenage girl with headphones tucked securely into her ears, made her way through the park. Her bag of groceries hung loosely at her side, and she absent-mindedly hummed to the beat of her music. Officer Greg, patrolling in his police car, drove slowly through the park's perimeter. His eyes darted from side to side, scanning the surroundings for anything out of the ordinary. His uniform was crisp, his gaze sharp, but hidden behind the badge was a man shaped by his own prejudices. His daily routine of keeping the streets safe was, to him, more of a hunt, especially when it involved people who didn't look like they belonged. And Jasmine, young, black, and alone, fit the description his mind had already conjured. Then, as if on cue, Greg saw her pause under the shade of an oak tree. Her bag slipped from her hand, and its contents spilled onto the grass. Canned goods, fruit, and bread scattered at her feet. Jasmine knelt, fumbling with her torn grocery bag, trying to gather everything as it rolled around. Greg narrowed his eyes, suspicion flaring. A girl checking her bag? In his mind, it wasn't groceries. It was something more sinister. The decision was made before logic had a chance to intervene. He pulled the car over, flashing the lights as if he had just caught a dangerous criminal. The siren stayed silent, but the flashing lights were enough to get everyone's attention. He stepped out of the car, boots hitting the pavement with authority. The badge on his chest gleamed under the dying sunlight. "Hey, you there? Stop what you're doing and step aside." His voice cut through the calm of the park, sharp and accusatory. Jasmine looked up, startled. Confusion danced across her face as she quickly stood, still holding on to her torn grocery bag. "I'm just picking up my stuff," she mumbled, trying to explain, but Greg wasn't interested in explanations. He approached her with a swagger, his hand hovering near his belt, ready to escalate if necessary. "What's in the bag? Empty your pockets," he demanded, already assuming the worst. Jasmine, trembling, opened the bag wider, showing the groceries, the torn packaging barely holding on to its contents. "It's just food," she said quietly, her voice wavering under the weight of his accusation. But Greg wasn't backing down. "I said step aside," he barked again, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the air grew thick, and onlookers began to take notice. At that moment, from across the park, John watched the scene unfold. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by time and hardship, but his gaze was steady. He had been on that bench for hours, seeking a moment of peace in a world that had long forgotten him. Yet, peace seemed elusive, even here. John rose slowly from his seat, his steps deliberate as he approached the scene. Without knowing who Greg was or what trouble might come, he couldn't stand by and watch this girl be bullied by someone hiding behind a badge. "Hey, officer," John called out, his voice calm but firm. "She's done nothing wrong. Let her go." Greg turned, his expression twisting into one of disbelief, then anger. "Mind your business, old man," he spat. "Unless you want a problem too." John stepped closer, not backing down. His weathered face didn't betray any fear, only resolve. "This is my business now," he said quietly, looking Greg in the eyes. "She's just trying to pick up her groceries." Jasmine, still shaking, took a step back, unsure of what would happen next. Greg, now visibly frustrated, decided that enough was enough. Without warning, he grabbed John by the collar and, with a violent shove, slammed him to the ground. A sickening crack echoed through the air as John's body hit the pavement, his bones snapping under the force. Jasmine screamed, her voice piercing through the park, but Greg was already cuffing John, his face twisted with arrogance. "Resisting arrest," he muttered, as if the words excused the brutality. John winced, pain shooting through him, but he didn't fight back. He remained silent, letting the scene play out. Greg hauled him up and shoved him into the back of the patrol car, not caring about the injury he had just caused. The crowd watched, whispers rising among them, but no one stepped forward. The badge, as always, was enough to silence questions. Greg didn't look back at Jasmine. He left her standing there, her groceries scattered once again on the ground, tears streaming down her face. With John locked in the back seat, Greg drove off, convinced that the day was just another successful arrest. Little did he know, this arrest would soon unravel everything. Inside the police station, the usual hum of activity filled the air. Officers walked briskly through the corridors, some filing reports, others engrossed in conversations that blurred into the background. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed, until Officer Greg stormed through the entrance, dragging John, handcuffed and limping behind him. Greg's face was smug, his arrogance palpable as he shoved John forward, forcing him toward the booking desk. The officers at the desk glanced up, some exchanging puzzled looks. There was no commotion, no resisting suspect. Yet, here was Greg, treating this older man like a dangerous criminal. John said nothing, his face calm, but his body betraying the pain from the earlier assault. The officer behind the desk raised an eyebrow. "What's the charge?" he asked, eyeing Greg with thinly veiled suspicion. Greg didn't hesitate. "Resisting arrest, suspicion of theft," he replied, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. He handed over John's identification, careful to avoid making eye contact with the older man. As far as Greg was concerned, this was just another routine arrest, an unfortunate person who got in his way. But something about the name on the ID caught the officer's attention. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, his brow furrowing. He didn't say anything, but the wheels in his mind were turning. There was something familiar about the man Greg had dragged in, something that didn't sit right. Greg, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room, led John down the hallway toward the holding cells. His heavy boots echoed off the cold tile floors as John limped beside him, his expression stoic despite the sharp pain in his leg. The officers they passed didn't say much, but their curious glances followed them. Whispers started to ripple through the station. Meanwhile, in his office, Captain David Harrison sat at his desk, engrossed in paperwork. His brow was furrowed, his pen scratching against the paper in the focused silence. But something in the back of his mind nagged at him. There had been a commotion earlier, nothing unusual for a precinct this size, but it had lingered longer than usual. He glanced at the clock, then at the window that looked out into the main room. And that's when he saw him. The man being led toward the cells, walking with a noticeable limp, caught his eye. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, even in pain, stirred a long-buried memory. Captain Harrison's pen stopped moving. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he strained to see more clearly. It couldn't be, could it? His mind raced back to a time long ago, before he was Captain Harrison, before he wore the badge. He was just a young soldier then, scared and lost in the chaos of war. And there was a man, a mentor, someone who had guided him through the darkest moments, saved his life more than once. That man's name was James "Jimmy" Carter. And now, as if brought back from a distant past, here he was, walking through his precinct in handcuffs. The recognition hit Captain Harrison like a blow. His breath caught in his throat, his mind struggling to reconcile the war hero he knew with the man being treated like a criminal in his station. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back in his haste. Without a word, he pushed through the door of his office, moving quickly toward the holding cells. As he approached, Greg was leaning against the wall, casually flipping through his notebook, seemingly unbothered by the situation. He didn't notice the way his father's eyes darkened as they landed on John. Harrison's voice was tight, barely contained. "Greg," he called, his tone sharper than usual. Greg glanced up, surprised by his father's sudden appearance. "What's up?" he asked, his usual cocky demeanor still intact. But Captain Harrison wasn't in the mood for games. He gestured toward John, who had sat down on the bench inside the holding cell, his head tilted back against the cold, concrete wall. "Do you know who that is?" Greg shrugged, glancing back at John with indifference. "Some homeless guy causing trouble. Got in my way while I was handling a situation." The captain's fist clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "That's James Carter, he said slowly, letting each word sink in. He saved my life during the war. He's a veteran. My mentor. Greg's face faltered for the first time. He blinked, looking back at John with fresh eyes, the realization starting to creep in. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. How was I supposed to know that? He muttered, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Captain Harrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, staring at the man who had once been his guide through the horrors of war, now sitting quietly in a police cell. The weight of the moment settled on him, and for the first time, the cracks in the authority he'd built around himself began to show. Captain David Harrison sat at his desk, staring blankly at the report in front of him. His office, usually filled with the hum of precinct activity, was eerily silent. The room felt colder, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a problem was brewing. And this was more than a problem. It was a disaster waiting to unfold. Greg, his son, had once again acted without thinking, but this time it was worse. Much worse. It wasn't just an ordinary citizen Greg had forcefully arrested. It was James "Jimmy" Carter, the man who had saved his life in the war. The veteran who had pulled him from the battlefield, bloodied and broken, and carried him to safety when all hope seemed lost. They had lost contact after the war, and Harrison had never expected to see him again, let alone in this way. But there he was, locked up in the holding cell, injured and falsely accused. David's hands shook slightly as he reached for the phone. He wanted to fix this, to make it all go away. For years, he had kept Greg's recklessness under wraps, using his authority to shield him from real consequences. But this time was different. This wasn't just about protecting his son. This was about protecting his career, his reputation. He needed to act fast. Greg entered the office without knocking, his usual cocky grin plastered across his face. He had no idea of the storm brewing. David looked up at his son, his jaw clenched tight. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" David's voice was barely above a whisper, but the anger was palpable. Greg, oblivious as ever, shrugged. "Just another punk who thought he could mouth off, Dad. I handled it." David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That man is James Carter, the man who saved my life, a decorated war hero. And you broke his damn bones?" For a moment, Greg faltered, the smug look slipping from his face. But only for a moment. "So what? He's just some homeless guy now. What difference does it make?" David felt the blood rush to his head. His son's arrogance, his inability to understand the gravity of the situation, was infuriating. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. "It makes every difference, Greg. You arrested him for no reason. You assaulted him. Do you understand how this looks? We can't let this get out. Not now." Greg leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his confidence returning. "So, what do we do? You've covered for me before. Just do it again." David's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to yell, to shake some sense into his son, but he couldn't. Not now. He had to be strategic. "I'll talk to Carter. Offer him something to keep him quiet. He's an honorable man. He'll understand. He has to." Greg grinned. "Knew you'd handle it." But David's heart was heavy. This wasn't like the other times. This was different. He could feel the walls closing in. The cover-up wouldn't be easy, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. He called for Carter to be brought to his office. Minutes later, John "Jimmy" Carter entered, his movements slow, his face etched with pain. He was older, more worn down than David remembered, but the dignity in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't flinch as he sat across from the man he had once saved. David cleared his throat, his words coming out more uncertain than he intended. "Jimmy, I'm sorry about all of this. I had no idea it was you." Carter's eyes never left David's. There was no warmth there, no recognition of the man he had once carried to safety. Just cold, hard disappointment. David continued, fumbling for words. "Look, I can make this right. We'll drop the charges. I'll make sure you're compensated for the injury. We'll keep this quiet. You and I both know how things can spiral out of control in situations like this." But Carter didn't respond. His silence was damning. David's voice grew more desperate. "Greg is my son, Jimmy. I can't let this ruin his life. He didn't know who you were. I'm asking you, as someone who saved my life, to help me protect him." Finally, Carter spoke, his voice low and firm. "This isn't about who I am. It's about what's right. You're asking me to forget what your son did because of who I was to you. But it shouldn't matter who I am. What matters is what he did, and that's something I can't ignore." David's face hardened. He hadn't expected this kind of defiance. "You don't understand the position you're in. I can make this very difficult for you, Jimmy. You think you've had it rough out there? You don't know what rough really is." Carter's expression didn't change. He had seen real danger, real threats, and this wasn't one of them. "You do what you need to do, David. But I won't be silenced." David stood there, the weight of his own corruption settling on his shoulders. He knew then that the situation had slipped beyond his control. His son, his career, his reputation, everything was hanging by a thread. And for the first time, he didn't know if he could fix it. 2 days had passed, and the atmosphere in the precinct was heavy with unspoken tension. Officers moved about their tasks, but whispers had begun circulating. Why was John still in custody? What was really going on behind the closed doors of Captain Harrison's office? The story of Greg's arrest had started to spread, and now questions lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Outside, the familiar hum of an engine broke the silence. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, its sleek and polished exterior standing out amidst the routine patrol cars. Eyes darted to the entrance as the door opened, and out stepped a man who commanded attention without a single word: the district police chief. His presence alone shifted the energy in the station. He wasn't just another high-ranking officer. He was the authority, overseeing the entire district, a man whose reputation was built on no-nonsense justice. Inside, the station fell still. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and the air grew thick. Every officer recognized the chief's arrival as something far beyond routine. Captain Harrison, who had been pacing anxiously in his office, stiffened the moment the chief entered the building. His heart pounded with the realization that whatever was coming wasn't going to be easy. The chief's stride was purposeful, his face unreadable as he made his way directly to Harrison's office. He pushed open the door without knocking, his eyes locking on Harrison with a cold intensity. Without preamble, the chief demanded an explanation. Why was John, this supposed suspect, still in custody? Captain Harrison, caught off guard by the abrupt confrontation, fumbled for words. His son, Officer Greg, had assured him it was all under control, that the situation was being handled quietly. But now, the storm had arrived, and there was no avoiding it. The chief's voice cut through Harrison's weak attempt at a defense. He wasn't interested in excuses. His focus shifted to the core of the issue. "That girl in the park," he said slowly, his words dripping with controlled anger. "The one your son harassed, nearly assaulted, she's my daughter." Harrison's face paled. The weight of those words crashed down on him like a hammer. For 2 days, he had thought he could manage this situation, brush it under the rug. But now, the stakes were higher than he had ever anticipated. Jasmine, the girl Greg had accused and nearly arrested, was the chief's daughter. The revelation hit with an intensity that could not be ignored. The chief wasn't done. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. "I've got footage," he said, his voice a low growl, barely containing his fury. He tapped the screen, and within moments, the room was filled with the undeniable truth. Surveillance cameras had captured everything. Greg's unjustified stop, his aggressive accusations, the violent force he used to subdue John. The screen flickered as Jasmine's spilled groceries came into view, the simple act of checking her bag, so horribly misconstrued. The silence in the room was deafening. Captain Harrison stood frozen, staring at the damning evidence. Every justification he had tried to build over the past 2 days crumbled in front of him. There was no defending this. The truth was inescapable. The chief's gaze never wavered. He turned to Harrison, his voice low but lethal. "Your son didn't just make a mistake. He abused his power. And you tried to cover it up?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy with finality. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and now there would be consequences. The station's meeting room was thick with tension, the air almost too heavy to breathe. At the head of the table sat the district police chief, his expression unreadable, but his authority undeniable. To his left, Captain David Harrison sat stiffly, his face drained of color, every muscle in his body tight with anticipation. On the opposite side of the room, Greg stood with a thin sheen of sweat forming on his brow, though he tried to keep up the appearance of arrogance. John, the quiet veteran, remained seated, calm as ever, his eyes focused on the floor, his broken body bearing the weight of injustice, but his spirit unyielding. The chief's gaze swept over the room, cold and sharp. He had heard enough. The surveillance footage was damning, the evidence irrefutable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, yet it carried the weight of finality. Officer Greg Harrison, the chief began, each word deliberate. Your conduct over the past few days has been nothing short of disgraceful. The abuse of your position, the assault on an innocent man, and the violation of a young woman's safety, all of it is beyond unacceptable. I've reviewed the footage, and it's clear that your actions were not just negligent, they were malicious. Greg shifted uncomfortably, the bravado he had worn like armor now slipping. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but one look from the chief silenced him. You are hereby dismissed from the police force with immediate effect, the chief continued, his tone unyielding. There will be an official investigation, and charges may follow. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, the room was silent. Greg, for the first time, looked genuinely shaken, his eyes darting nervously toward his father. The chief's attention shifted to Captain Harrison, who sat motionless, his hands clenched in fists beneath the table. The chief's gaze hardened. As for you, Captain Harrison, the chief said, his voice tinged with disappointment, your attempt to cover up this incident, to protect your son at the cost of justice, is equally unforgivable. You should have known better. You knew who this man was. He motioned to John, who still sat quietly, his expression unchanged. The captain swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. You are suspended, effective immediately, the chief declared. A full investigation will be conducted into how you handled this situation. If any further misconduct is uncovered, you will face consequences just as severe as your son's. Captain Harrison's face fell. The proud, controlled exterior he had maintained for decades was beginning to crack. He had always believed that his authority, his position, could shield him from the fallout. But now, that shield had shattered. John remained silent through it all. His eyes lifted only briefly, meeting the chief's. There was no need for words. The truth had been revealed, and justice, though delayed, was finally taking its course. As the chief stood, the meeting was over. He walked toward the door, pausing only to nod at John, a gesture of respect for the man who had withstood more than anyone in the room could imagine. Greg and his father remained seated, both of them broken in their own way. Greg's arrogance had crumbled, leaving only fear in its place. His father, once a man of power and influence, was now stripped of both. In the end, the consequences were inevitable. The truth had come to light, and with it, the weight of every wrong decision they had made. For the Harrisons, this was the beginning of the end. But for John, it was a small victory, one that spoke to something larger than any of them. Justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. The precinct parking lot was nearly empty, bathed in the golden hue of a setting sun. John, now free, stepped outside, his limp more pronounced from the pain in his leg. His movements were slow but steady, each step deliberate, as if he were carrying the weight of the past 2 days on his shoulders. His clothes were still wrinkled from his time in custody, but his head remained high, a quiet strength radiating from him. The cool evening breeze carried a sense of closure, but John knew this wasn't the end, just a step forward in a world that seemed determined to knock him down. The chief stood by his side, watching him carefully. There was a respect in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the dignity John had maintained throughout the ordeal. As they reached the black SUV, the chief broke the silence. John, he said, his voice soft but firm, you've shown more integrity in these past 2 days than most men do in a lifetime. My daughter, she's safe because of you. I can never repay you for that, John said nothing, just nodded. His expression was calm, unreadable, but the chief knew he understood. The chief opened the car door and motioned for John to get inside. "Let me take you to the hospital. You shouldn't be walking around like this," he added. John hesitated for a moment, glancing at the precinct one last time. The building that had held him captive now seemed smaller, less significant in the grand scheme of things. He sighed and then climbed into the car, letting the door close with a soft thud. The engine hummed to life as they pulled out of the parking lot, the city streets growing quieter as the sun dipped below the horizon. As they drove, the chief glanced at John, his mind already made up. "I've been thinking," he started, "I could use someone like you. Not just as a thank you, but because I trust you. How would you feel about being my family's driver?" John turned to him, surprised. The chief continued, his eyes fixed on the road. "It's not just a job, John. It's a way to make sure people like Greg don't get to people like Jasmine or you. I need someone who knows what it means to protect others." For a moment, John didn't respond. He looked out the window, watching the city blur by. The offer was unexpected, but there was something about the chief's sincerity that struck a chord in him. After everything, maybe this was the universe's way of offering him a new beginning. "All right," John finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll do it." The chief nodded, a sense of relief passing over him. They drove in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, one filled with mutual respect. John's thoughts wandered, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't filled with bitterness or exhaustion. There was hope, even if it was just a small spark. The road ahead was long, but John knew he would face it head-on, just as he had faced every challenge in his life. This time, though, he wouldn't be doing it alone. And as the SUV disappeared into the dusk, it became clear this wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the start of something new, something better.